didn't learn that my family was planning my funeral in one shocking moment. It revealed itself slowly, in fragments, the way rot spreads behind clean walls. It started with a strange heaviness in my own house, a feeling that conversations stopped when I entered a room and resumed only after I left. I had lived in that house long enough to recognize its normal sounds, and this new silence was not peace, it was calculation. My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and I have spent most of my life believing that if you raised your children with honesty and sacrifice, they would return those values when you needed them most. That belief began to crack the afternoon I returned home earlier than expected from a doctor's appointment that confirmed I was healthy enough to keep living independently. As I set my purse down in the hallway, I heard my daughter and son speaking in the dining room. Their voices were calm, organized, almost professional, the way people speak when emotions have already been removed from the equation. I heard my name, followed by words that did not belong together: service, timing, arrangements, afterward. At first, I assumed they were talking about someone else, because the human mind resists accepting cruelty from familiar voices. But then my daughter mentioned my house, and my son responded with a comment about how it would be easier to sell quickly, and something inside me went cold. I stood there, unseen, listening to my children speak about my life as if it were already concluded, as if my presence was merely an inconvenient delay in plans they had already finalized. The shock was not loud, it was precise. It sliced through years of memory, through scraped knees I had cleaned, tuition I had paid, nights I stayed awake worrying about futures that apparently no longer included me. What hurt most was not the discussion of death itself. It was the absence of doubt in their voices. They were not asking if, they were deciding when. Only weeks earlier, after a brief medical scare caused by exhaustion, they had begun hovering with concern that felt excessive. They insisted on helping with paperwork, managing accounts, reviewing my will just to be safe. I had interpreted it as care, because that is what mothers do. We translate discomfort into love to preserve the bond. But standing there, listening to their quiet efficiency, I realized that concern had been a cover, not a motive. They had already rewritten the story of my life in their minds, recasting me as fragile, confused, and conveniently temporary. My home, the one I paid for with decades of discipline, the one that still held my husband's books exactly where he left them, had been reduced to a line item. My life had become a schedule. I stepped back silently, my heart steady but heavy, and returned to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands that had built a family and held it together through far worse than old age. They did not tremble. Instead, they reminded me of something I had learned long ago in quieter battles. When people believe you are finished, they stop hiding their intentions. And in that dangerous honesty, they hand you the truth. From that day on, I stopped seeing my family as I once had and began seeing patterns instead, small behaviors that only make sense once trust has already been broken. They started visiting more often, but the visits felt staged, like inspections disguised as concern. My daughter would walk through the house slowly, commenting on how cluttered it felt, how stairs could become dangerous at my age, how maybe it was time to think about something more manageable. My son, who had never shown interest in my finances before, suddenly wanted to understand every account I had, every policy, every document stored in my files. They spoke gently, patiently, the way people speak when they believe they are dealing with someone incapable of resistance. I noticed how they exchanged looks when I answered questions clearly, how disappointment flickered across their faces when I remembered details they hoped I wouldn't. They weren't helping, they were testing. Each conversation felt like an evaluation, each smile measured, each pause intentional. I watched them move through my life with an entitlement that stunned me, opening drawers, reorganizing papers, making suggestions that sounded like decisions already made. They talked about my comfort while ignoring my wishes, about my safety while stripping away my independence piece by piece. At family dinners, conversations shifted away from shared memories and toward logistics. Who would handle what? Who would stay where? How things would be divided. My opinions were acknowledged with nods and then quietly dismissed, as if I had already said my final word years ago. What unsettled me most was how natural it all seemed to them, how easily they slipped into roles that placed me on the margins of my own life. They no longer asked what I wanted, they discussed what made sense. And in their definition of sense, I was no longer a person with agency. I was a problem to be managed, a timeline to be controlled. At night, lying awake in the house that suddenly felt unfamiliar, I replayed conversations in my mind, noticing details I had once ignored. The way my daughter corrected my memory in front of others, the way my son spoke for me even when I was sitting right there, the subtle shift from inclusion to exclusion. It wasn't hatred driving them, I realized. It was convenience. I was standing in the way of plans they felt entitled to carry out. And as that understanding settled in, something else emerged alongside it. Not panic, not despair, but a steady, deliberate awareness. I began documenting everything quietly, saving emails, noting dates, observing who said what and when. I didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't warn them. I let them believe their version of me was accurate, because people are most careless when they think they've already won. Inside, however, a different process had begun, one rooted not in anger, but in clarity. They thought time was on their side. They had no idea I was already using it far more carefully than they were. The more they involved themselves in my life, the more I realized how carefully they were shaping a narrative that did not belong to me. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about control, about rewriting my identity in a way that justified their plans. My daughter began correcting me in public over the smallest things, insisting I had already told a story differently, smiling apologetically at others as if to excuse my supposed confusion. My son started speaking on my behalf during conversations, answering questions before I could open my mouth, gently placing a hand on my shoulder as if to guide me back into place. At first, I wondered if I was imagining it, if sensitivity came with age the way stiffness does. But patterns don't lie. The same comments, the same glances, the same quiet authority asserted again and again. They scheduled appointments without asking me, rearranged my calendar, and framed every decision as a favor I should be grateful for. I listened as they discussed options that would simplify things, options that involved other people making choices for me while I faded politely into the background. What disturbed me most was how convincing they sounded, not just to others, but to themselves. They spoke as if my independence were already a liability, as if my opinions were obstacles rather than contributions. I realized then that once people decide who you are, facts become inconvenient. They stopped asking what I wanted because they no longer believed it mattered. I began noticing how often they mentioned doctors, evaluations, paperwork, and legal terms, slipping them into conversations casually, normalizing ideas that should have been discussed openly and with consent. They wanted the groundwork laid quietly, efficiently, without resistance. Meanwhile, I continued my routines as usual: morning walks, reading in the afternoon, managing my own affairs. But I did so with heightened awareness. I watched how information moved through the family, how quickly a small comment became exaggerated concern by the time it reached someone else. I noticed how my absence from a room changed the tone of discussion, how laughter returned once I was gone. It was painful, but pain sharpens perception. I understood that confronting them would only accelerate their efforts. Denial would give them urgency. So I chose restraint. I answered questions carefully, shared nothing unnecessary, and allowed their assumptions to grow unchecked. Every underestimation became a window into their thinking. Every careless remark revealed more than they intended. In that quiet observation, I began to see the full shape of what they were doing, not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that I no longer counted as the author of my own life. And once I saw that clearly, I knew I could never unsee it. What made everything feel even more unsettling was how quickly the rest of the family accepted the version of events my children were feeding them. Relatives who had once called me for advice now spoke to me with cautious sympathy, asking how I was feeling rather than what I was thinking. Conversations shifted, softened, as if I were made of glass. I could feel the distance growing, subtle but deliberate, and I understood then how powerful a repeated story can be when the person at its center is quietly erased. Invitations became conditional, plans were made without consulting me, and decisions about my own life were discussed in rooms I was no longer invited into. I remember one afternoon when my sister stopped by and spoke slowly, carefully choosing her words, asking if I was managing okay on my own. The question wasn't concern, it was confirmation. I saw it in her eyes. She had already been briefed. The story had traveled faster than I had realized, spreading through the family like an agreed-upon truth. That was when it became clear this wasn't just a misunderstanding between children and an aging mother. It was a coordinated shift, a collective agreement that my role had changed without my consent. They were building a world in which I existed only as a responsibility, not a person. I felt a deep, quiet grief then, not for myself, but for the trust I had given so freely for so many years. Yet beneath that grief was something steadier, something I hadn't felt in a long time: focus. I began organizing my days with intention, separating emotion from action, learning who said what and who repeated it. I paid attention to timelines, to contradictions, to the way concern was used as a shield against accountability. I realized that once people decide you are weak, they stop guarding their words. They assume you won't notice, won't remember, won't act. And in that assumption, they leave doors open. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. Time, I had learned, moves differently when people believe they've already reached the end. By then, I understood that whatever they were planning required my silence, and silence was something I could manage better than they ever imagined. I began playing the role they had written for me, but only on the surface. I agreed when they suggested things, nodded when they explained matters I already knew, and thanked them for help I hadn't asked for. It wasn't weakness, it was camouflage. My daughter started keeping a small notebook when she visited, jotting things down as if tracking my decline, while my son took over scheduling appointments I never requested. They spoke to each other in front of me as though I were no longer fully present, using phrases like, "She gets overwhelmed," and "It's better if we decide." Each time they did, they revealed how far they had already gone in convincing themselves that my consent was no longer necessary. Behind closed doors, however, I was doing my own work. I reviewed my documents carefully, reread correspondence, and made quiet notes of every inconsistency in their stories. I paid attention to how quickly my daughter changed her tone when others were around, how my son avoided specifics when asked direct questions. I noticed how often they framed urgency as care, pushing decisions forward before anyone had time to reflect. The house had become a stage, and they believed I was merely part of the background. I let them believe it. At night, when the rooms were still, I sat with my thoughts and acknowledged a painful truth. The people I had trusted most were no longer acting in my best interest. Accepting that didn't harden me, it clarified me. I wasn't interested in revenge fueled by anger. I wanted understanding, precision, and truth. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to go and who else they were willing to involve. And so I waited, listened, and learned, allowing their confidence to grow while my resolve settled into something quiet and unshakable. The turning point came not with a confrontation, but with a moment of carelessness on their part, the kind that happens when people grow too comfortable inside a lie. One evening, while my daughter was in the kitchen answering a call she assumed was private, I overheard her say my name followed by the words "doctor's statement," and "it won't be a problem." Her voice carried the same confidence I had heard weeks earlier in the dining room, steady and assured, as if the outcome were already guaranteed. I didn't move, didn't interrupt, didn't let my presence be known. Instead, I listened as she spoke about paperwork, timelines, and how everything would be easier once it was official. When she hung up and turned back toward me, her expression softened instantly, slipping back into concern, asking if I needed anything. I smiled and said no. Inside, however, a line had been crossed. Until then. I had suspected intention. Now I understood direction. They weren't just preparing for my death. They were laying the groundwork to take control of my life while I was still living. That realization didn't frighten me. It sharpened me. I began revisiting my past with a new lens, remembering situations where I had protected others by stepping in quietly, resolving problems without drama or exposure. I had done it my entire career, often without recognition, because effective solutions rarely announce themselves. That skill hadn't disappeared with age, it had been refined. I started reaching out to people outside the family, individuals who had known me long enough to recognize consistency, competence, and clarity. I spoke carefully, not to accuse, but to establish context, to make sure my voice existed beyond the version being circulated behind my back. Each conversation restored a small piece of ground that had been taken from me without permission. I realized then that the most dangerous thing my family had done wasn't underestimating my memory. It was underestimating my patience. They believed urgency was on their side. They had no idea I was already several steps ahead, not rushing, not reacting, but building something solid enough to stand when their version of events inevitably collapsed under its own weight. As the weeks passed, their confidence became unmistakable, and with it came a subtle shift in how openly they discussed their plans around me. They no longer bothered lowering their voices as much, no longer paused conversations when I entered a room. It was as if I had already been mentally relocated, present in body, absent in authority. My daughter began referencing future changes as if they were inevitable, saying things like, "When we get everything sorted," and "once this phase is over," never specifying what that phase was meant to be. My son spoke about responsibilities he would soon have, explaining them to others with the tone of someone stepping into a role already assigned. I watched how they rehearsed these ideas, repeating them until they sounded natural, until doubt had been smoothed out by familiarity. It was painful to witness, but pain has a way of stripping illusions down to their core. I realized they weren't acting out of malice alone. They were acting out of certainty, convinced the story they had written would never be challenged. That certainty made them careless. They began contradicting themselves in small ways, forgetting which version they had told to whom, assuming I would never notice. I noticed everything. Dates didn't line up. Statements shifted. Details changed. I kept my responses neutral, my expressions unreadable, allowing them to fill the silence with explanations that only deepened the inconsistencies. Outside the house, I strengthened connections quietly, ensuring that my daily routines, decisions, and capabilities were seen and documented by people who had no stake in diminishing me. Each interaction became a reminder that I was still fully present, still capable, still in control of my own mind. Inside the family circle, however, I allowed the illusion to continue. The more they believed they were managing me, the more they revealed about themselves. They didn't realize that by treating me as invisible, they had made themselves transparent. The moment they finally acted was quieter than I expected, almost anticlimactic, which only confirmed how long they had been preparing for it. It began with a meeting they framed as casual, inviting me to sit down together, just to talk things through. Their voices gentle, rehearsed, and falsely reassuring. They spoke about my well-being, about how stressful life had become for me, about how they only wanted to make things easier. My daughter slid a folder across the table, its neat tabs and highlighted sections meant to look official enough to discourage questions. My son watched me closely, not with concern, but with anticipation. Inside that folder were documents designed to limit my authority over my own life, written in language that assumed my agreement before I had given it. They explained each page slowly, as though repetition might dull my ability to understand, occasionally glancing at one another to confirm they were staying on script. I listened without interrupting, letting them finish, letting them believe the performance was working. What they didn't realize was that I recognized every tactic, the selective urgency, the framing of control as kindness, the way dissent was subtly labeled as confusion. When they finally paused and waited for my response, the room felt suspended, as if even the walls were listening. I thanked them for their concern and asked for time to review everything on my own, something they clearly hadn't anticipated. Their smiles tightened, their reassurances grew more insistent, but I remained calm, unmoved. That calm unsettled them more than anger ever could. As the meeting ended, I could feel their frustration beneath the surface politeness, the first crack in the certainty they had carried for months. They believed this conversation marked the beginning of the end for me. In reality, it marked the moment their plans stepped into the light, where it could no longer survive on whispers and assumptions alone. After that meeting, everything moved faster, as if they sensed time slipping in a direction they could no longer control. Their patience thinned, and the careful politeness they had practiced for months began to crack. My daughter called more frequently, pressing for decisions, reminding me of documents I needed to sign, framing urgency as responsibility. My son stopped asking and started telling, speaking with an authority that did not belong to him, referencing conversations I had never agreed to and outcomes I had never approved. They assumed resistance meant confusion, that hesitation was proof of decline, and in doing so, they revealed how fragile their plan truly was. I watched them unravel under the weight of their own expectations, contradicting each other, revising explanations mid-sentence, growing visibly irritated when I asked simple, reasonable questions. Their version of events depended on my compliance, and every calm refusal weakened it. Meanwhile, the groundwork I had quietly laid began to hold. Conversations I had documented resurfaced through other channels. Timelines were questioned. Assumptions were challenged. People who had once accepted the story without hesitation began asking for clarity, and clarity has a way of making manipulation uncomfortable. I noticed the shift in tone when my daughter realized others were no longer nodding automatically, when my son sensed that authority must be earned, not claimed. They had expected silence to mean surrender. Instead, silence had allowed truth to gather strength. By the time they understood that the narrative was no longer theirs alone, it was already too late to reshape it. The control they believed was inevitable had begun to slip, not dramatically, but decisively, the way certainty fades when exposed to daylight. When everything finally came to a stop, it didn't end with shouting or dramatic confrontations. It ended with silence, the kind that follows when people realize their assumptions have failed them. The plans that had once been spoken so confidently were suddenly avoided, conversations grew careful, and the certainty my family had carried for months dissolved into something fragile and defensive. I continued living in my home, managing my life, making my own decisions, while the story they had tried to write quietly collapsed under the weight of truth. No apologies were offered, no explanations given because some betrayals are too deliberate to be undone with words. What remained was clarity about who I was, what I was capable of, and how easily people mistake age for weakness. I didn't need revenge fueled by anger. What mattered was reclaiming my place in my own life, on my own terms. If something similar has ever happened to you, if someone tried to take control of your life, your choices, or your future simply because they thought you were vulnerable, I want you to share it in the comments. Your story matters more than you may realize. And if this story resonated with you, make sure you subscribe. Don't underestimate the power of women.